A lot of people are very critical of the Hobbit movies, and for good reason for the most part. While they're enjoyable popcorn crunchers that don't require much brain power to understand, there is definitely a difference between the book and movies that diehard Tolkien fans just can't get over. After analyzing every page of the Hobbit book and comparing it to the adapted trilogy, finding every difference along the way, I think I've realized one of the key issues Peter Jackson faced. And that is the fact that Tolkien's writing style doesn't fit a typical Hollywood production in the slightest. For example, in other videos on my channel, I've talked about how Tolkien often gave key plot points to smaller characters that you might only read about in one chapter. But in a movie, it's difficult to do that, as you usually focus on the main cast and hand all the important moments to them. Similarly, we find a major difference between the way Tolkien ended stories and the way that a movie ends. For example, the Hobbit films focused on the emotional impact of Thorin and Bilbo's relationship, with the final scenes showing Thorin's death and then young Bilbo's final line directly addressing his friendship with the king under the mountain. But Tolkien never wrote his endings in that way. Instead, Tolkien preferred to tie up every loose end in the most logical way possible, even if this meant devoting an entire chapter and a half to the return journey Bilbo took to get back to the Shire. And that is exactly what I'll be discussing today as we finish up our last episode of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the Hobbit Edition. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to Fact or Fantasy, a channel dedicated to Tolkien and his incredible lore. If you're new here, Movies vs. Manuscripts is a series that I started years ago where I dedicated myself to going page by page and scene by scene through the Lord of the Rings trilogy and finding every difference between the books and movies. Well, after finishing the original trilogy, which you can watch all of those episodes using the playlists on my channel by the way, I decided to do The Hobbit. The Hobbit has been much more difficult than anticipated, but we've finally done it, and in only 13 episodes I might add. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the 4 major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. And by the way, I am recording this the week after Thanksgiving, and I was sick all last week, so if I sound stuffed up, it's cause I am, and I'm still recovering. But if Bilbo handled a dragon, I think I can handle a bad cold, even if I don't have my handkerchief. So let's recap what happened in these final scenes of the movie, that way it's fresh in our mind for the analysis. Picking up from where we left off last week, we cut away from Bilbo and Thorin to see Thranduil talking to his son Legolas and telling him to go find a man named Strider. Then the Elven King sees Tauriel holding Kili, and he tells her that her love was real. Then we see Gandalf and Bilbo sitting down on Raven Hill and the dwarves of Thorin's company gathering around Thorin's body. The movie then shows the funeral of Fili, Kili, and Thorin, and afterwards Bilbo says his goodbyes and leaves. We then get a very brief traveling montage of Gandalf and Bilbo riding on the countryside, and then Gandalf leaves Bilbo to finish the last stage of his journey alone. Bilbo then arrives home to see people auctioning off his items and his home, and he quickly puts a stop to it. The auctioneer asks for some sort of verification that he is indeed Bilbo Baggins, and Bilbo pulls out his contract with Thorin's company. After the auctioneer asks who Thorin Oakenshield is, Bilbo says that he was my friend. And finally, after getting a brief transition scene of Bilbo looking at the ring, we fast forward to the future when Gandalf arrives at Bag End for Bilbo's 111th birthday party. And that is where the movie ends. Now, to start things off this week, we're going to look at the character, timeline, and location changes first, but our plot changes will be a little unique. Since essentially the movie changed everything about the plot for these last couple of chapters, I'm simply going to go through what Tolkien wrote and share with you the true ending that some of you might have never heard. But first, we of course need to address our character, timeline, and location changes. Starting with our characters, we of course have the additions of Legolas and Tauriel, which I've addressed pretty much in every episode, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now. Other than those additions, we actually have a couple of small omissions in these final moments. First and foremost is Beorn. In the movie, Beorn just kind of vanishes after the battle, but in the book he is a central part of the return journey. He travels with Bilbo and Gandalf all the way back to his home and hosts them for several weeks. Secondly, Elrond and the Elves of Rivendell are completely missing from the return journey, which bleeds right into our timeline changes as the movie makes the journey home feel like a quick weekend trip. 1 minute they're at Erebor and the next they're at the Shire border. But in reality, months of time are skipped over. They leave the mountain before winter, stay at Beorn's through the cold months, and don't get back to Bag End until the summer. So yeah, the movie timeline is heavily condensed. And finally, for location, because of those return journey cuts, we miss out on 3 key spots for a return trip. We don't see Beorn's house, we don't see the journey around the north of Mirkwood, and we don't see Rivendell. It's a straight shot from point A to point B in Peter Jackson's version. Now, before we get to the true ending of Bilbo's journey, I want to give a huge shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, RoboSteve, and the rest of my incredible Patreon and YouTube members who have supported the series from episode 1. Also, special shout out to our newest members, Soul and Brian. By the way, if you're sad that this series is coming to an end and want to relive the story for yourself, I highly recommend grabbing the audiobook on Audible. Listening to the songs and the descriptions of the journey home is a vibe that the movies just couldn't capture. I have a link in the description that gets you 1 audiobook for free, so go ahead and claim your free trial today. It supports the channel and lets you dive deeper into Middle-earth. Now, with that being said, let's dive into the final category of plot. As I mentioned in the intro, the movie's ending is vastly different from the book. So instead of going scene by scene, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happens in the final 2 chapters of the book, which are the return journey and the last stage, just so you can see how much richer Tolkien's ending really is. Perhaps not as dramatic, but it definitely ties up the loose ends. To start things off, we pick up partway through chapter 18, as the beginning of the chapter details the ending of the Battle of the 5 Armies, which we already talked about in the last episode. After we learn about how this battle ends and Bilbo reunites with Thorin on his deathbed, we read about Thorin's funeral. This is something we see in the movie a little, but without some of the context. For example, we read in the book that Bard returned the Arkenstone to Thorin by setting it on his chest and declaring that it shall stay there until the mountain falls. Then the Elven King laid Orcrist next to Thorin. If you remember in the book, Thorin got Orcrist from the Troll Horde way early on in their adventure, but it was confiscated from him back when they got captured in Mirkwood. In the movie, they show him getting it back when Legolas saves his life in the most unrealistic way possible, but in the book, it's a little bit more logical, per usual. We read that legend says the mountain could never be taken by surprise again, as the sword glowed brightly if orcs were ever near, which is a pretty cool bit of lore. Following the funeral, we learn about the new political landscape of the mountain. With Thorin gone, his cousin Dane Ironfoot took up the mantle and became king under the mountain. It's a bittersweet ascension though, because we learn that Fili and Kili fell defending Thorin, shielding their uncle with their own bodies. The remaining 10 companions stay with Dane, who proved to be a wise ruler. He honored the agreement Thorin made on his deathbed and gave Bard a 14th share of the treasure to rebuild Dale. Remember, in the book, Thorin had agreed to trade Bilbo's 14th share of the treasure for the Arkenstone, so that is the promise that Dane is fulfilling. As for Bard, we learn just how honorable he is, as he sends much of that gold to the Master of Laketown, and even returns the Emeralds of Gerion to the Elven King. It really ties up the loose ends regarding the treasure in a satisfying way that the movie glossed over. And just wait, we'll hear more about Bard and the Master of Laketown later on. Moving on though, we have the matter of Bilbo's reward. In the movie, Bilbo leaves with just a small bag and a couple treasure chests, and is treated as a quick goodbye. But in the book, Bard actually offers him a magnificent amount of wealth. He declares that Bilbo should be rewarded most of all, but Bilbo, ever the practical hobbit, declines the full share. He frankly tells them that he has no idea how he would get that much gold back home without war and murder. So just like the movie, he only accepts 2 small chests, one filled with silver and one with gold, just enough for one strong pony to carry. It's a humble choice that really defines Bilbo's character. Now that I think about it and I'm picturing it in my head, I believe a change in the movie is that he only takes 1 chest as he walks back to the Shire and isn't on a pony. But in the book, he has a pony, so he's able to take the 2 chests, plus a little bit extra that we'll learn about later on. Anyway, after the emotional goodbyes, Bilbo rides away with Gandalf and Beorn. In the movie, Beorn is basically an extra in the final battle, but here he becomes a travel companion. They travel with the Elven King's host for a while until they reach the border of Mirkwood. Here, in a moment totally absent from the film, Bilbo gives a necklace of silver and pearls to the Elven King as a thank you for his hospitality. He cheekily notes that a burglar has his feelings and he had drunk a lot of the king's wine and eaten his bread while invisible in his halls. Don't forget that they were trapped in Mirkwood for weeks, and the whole time Bilbo had to survive. So while he was trapped in Mirkwood, he quite literally was a burglar, running around invisible and stealing food from the Elven King's halls. The king is moved by this gesture and names Bilbo an elf friend and blessed. From there, the party avoids Mirkwood entirely, traveling around the north edge of the forest until they arrive at Beorn's house, and they don't just stop for a quick lunch like they did in the second movie. They stay there for the entire winter. They celebrate a warm and merry Yuletide with Beorn, enjoying the peace that has finally come to the region. It's a stark contrast to the movie where they seem to rush home. It's only when spring arrives that Bilbo and Gandalf finally take their leave. As they go through the high pass where they were captured by goblins so long ago, Bilbo looks back and says, "So comes snow after fire, and even dragons have their ending." A poetic way to close the chapter on his adventures in the wild. And this leads us into the final chapter, which is called The Last Stage. On May the 1st, Bilbo and Gandalf return to Rivendell, the last homely house. They are greeted with song by elves, and this is where we get a crucial bit of lore that explains Gandalf's absence. Gandalf tells Elrond the tale of their adventures, and Bilbo overhears that Gandalf had been at a great council of white wizards. They had finally succeeded in driving the necromancer from his dark hold in the south of Mirkwood. And this explains to Bilbo why Gandalf had to leave Thorin's company at the edge of Mirkwood so many months ago. After resting for about a week, they say farewell to Elrond and head home. On the way, Bilbo remembers the spot where the three trolls, Tom, Bert, and Bill, had turned to stone. Now I know it's been a while, but do you remember that some of the dwarves actually buried treasure from the troll horde? Well, Bilbo hadn't forgotten, and upon arriving at this location, he and Gandalf dug up the chest. They find it untouched and split the share, filling new bags on their ponies. It's a nice full circle moment, reclaiming the treasure from their very first adventure. It's also funny to me that Gandalf took some of the gold because you wouldn't think that he'd need the treasure. But Bilbo refuses to take the whole amount and says that Gandalf can probably find a better use for it, hence why they split it. And Gandalf replies, "Indeed I can, share and share alike." This makes me happy as I imagine Gandalf just traveling to different towns and handing out gold to those in need. Anyway, this brings us to the final leg of the journey, and a moment that differs slightly from the film. In the movie, Gandalf says goodbye to Bilbo at the borders of the Shire, warning him about magic rings. But in the book, Gandalf actually rides with him all the way back to Bag End. They crest a rise, and Bilbo sees his hill in the distance, stopping to recite a poem about roads going ever on. It's a quiet moment that shows just how ready he is to be home. Now, the movie shows this, but it only briefly addresses the main antagonists, the Sackville Bagginses. In the book, they are busy measuring Bilbo's rooms, hoping to move in. Bilbo's return causes a massive legal disturbance that lasts for years as he has to convince people who he is and actually buy back his own furniture from his neighbors. And sadly, he loses his reputation. He is no longer considered respectable by the hobbits, who think he's now queer and mutter about tunnels stuffed with treasure. But Bilbo doesn't mind. He hangs his sword, Sting, over the mantelpiece and is quite content using his magic ring to hide from unpleasant callers. The book ends not with a cliffhanger or a setup for The Lord of the Rings, but with a quiet visit years later. One evening, there's a ring at the door, and it's Gandalf and Balin. Balin has a magnificent jeweled belt and a long white beard. They sit by the fire, and Balin shares news of the East. He tells Bilbo that Dale is rebuilt and rich, Lake Town is prosperous, and there is a great friendship between elves, dwarves, and men. It's a confirmation that their struggle and the entire journey was worth it. We also learn of the fate of the old master of Lake Town. He caught dragon sickness after Bard sent him some of the treasure, and he fled with the gold that Bard gave him, and died of starvation in the waste, deserted by his companions. A tragic but fitting end for a greedy man. And finally, the book closes with a beautiful exchange. Gandalf tells Bilbo that he shouldn't think all his adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck for his sole benefit. He implies that Bilbo was just a small piece in a much larger story that was meant to happen. Bilbo laughs at this, hands him the tobacco jar, and says, "Thank goodness." And that, my friends, is how The Hobbit truly ends. It's a story about a small person finding their place in a big world, and coming home changed for the better. So what do you think? Do you prefer the movie's dramatic conclusion that tugs on your heartstrings? Or would you have preferred the slow, comforting journey that ties up loose ends? Let me know in the comments below. It has been an absolute honor to go on this journey with you all through Middle-earth. Analyzing these movies has been a labor of love, and despite it being much more difficult than doing The Lord of the Rings, I still enjoyed it. Although, much like Bilbo, I am happy that this journey is over, and I can now sit back in my chair and relax for a bit. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the full playlist to binge the entire series from start to finish. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.